you ever considered hiring a personal coach? The key tool of coaching is asking empowering questions to help clients live more fulfilling lives. I'm currently training to become a certified professional coach, and I will begin to accept a limited number of clients in November 2019. Meanwhile, I'm also doing some free introductory discovery sessions. If you think you might benefit from this approach, you can email me at docartemis@gmail.com. Welcome to Books and Ideas. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell. Since I launched this podcast back in 2006, I've talked to guests from a wide variety of fields, from science to science fiction. But today I have my first historian, Liz Covart from Ben Franklin's world. Before I jump into the interview, I want to remind you that you can get complete show notes and additional episodes at booksandideas.com. You can also send me email at docartemis@gmail.com. You can give me voice feedback at speakpipe.com/docartemis. And you can post to the Books and Ideas Facebook fan page. Please subscribe to Books and Ideas in your favorite podcast app. And don't forget, you can now support the show via Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/Books and Ideas. Liz Covart, it's great to have you on Books and Ideas.
Thank you so much for having me, Ginger.
You want to start out by just telling us a little bit about yourself, like where you grew up and how you got interested in history?
Sure. Well, I'm a Boston-born, New Hampshire-bred New Englander. I grew up in an area that really values its history, and my dad worked in Boston. So every year, at least once a year, we were walking sites on the Freedom Trail, which is this red trail that's painted around the streets of Boston from Boston Common up to the Bunker Hill Monument and Charlestown Navy Yard in Charlestown, which is a neighborhood in Boston. And it links all these different historic sites associated with the American Revolution. So I know between all those walks and the fact that my parents gave me a book allowance, we didn't have a cash allowance, we were allowed an allowance of books every week. I was reading a lot of history, and I just know from reading those books and walking the Freedom Trail and visiting these sites that I fell in love with the American Revolution. And I do remember thinking one time in like 7th grade that I needed to know more about American history. And I thought, if I just read more books, I'll start chronologically, I'll read from the colonial period up through the modern day. And I got stuck in the Revolution, and here we are all these years later, and I'm still there. It is my favorite period, and that's what I like to study.
Can you tell me a little bit more about why this particular period of time appeals to you so much?
It's an interesting question. And the more I think about it, I think it has to do with the fact that history really tells us who we are and how we came to be who we are. And the history of early America in particular does this for Americans. Through the early American past, we can see that there were an array of diverse peoples trying to find ways just to get along and live with each other on the North American continent. So we tend to see in these periods from about 1450 to 1820, which is about roughly how historians define early America. We tend to see during that period lots of imperial stories of Native Americans, Europeans, Euro-Americans, all vying for control and jockeying for power and position in North America. If you think about our present day, we're still seeing these types of stories. We see diverse peoples in the United States as well as in North America just trying to get along with each other and see what they can do. We can see that the United States practices diplomacy, trying to get along with other nations and peoples around the world. And we can even see that among Americans in general, right? You live down in Alabama, I live up in Massachusetts, and we're Americans and we're friends, and that's great. But there are some cultural differences we have amongst us because we live and grew up in these very different places. So Americans with different backgrounds struggle with this. So when you look at the early American past, you can really see, if we go from that 1450 date of early America, we can see that what we're experiencing is part of a continuous 530-year struggle in North America, trying to get along, trying to interact with each other, just trying to be in North America. And so I do think that's what makes early American history pretty special and why I love to study it so much.
Yeah, I haven't read that much, but What little I've read, one of the things that impressed me when I was reading John Adams, which I think is an entry book from those of us that are non-historians, dirty politics started awfully early too.
Yeah, everybody was jockeying for power, and you can see that in the courts of England too. If you want to take British North America as a starting point, you can see it in all the monarchies really of Europe when people are doing that, and probably in some Native American communities, the way that they were structured. And power is like one of these things that everybody wants and will do what they need to acquire it.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking of Jefferson because it seems like he might have been one of the first mudslingers. And then, of course, there was the fact that some of the people wrote with history in mind. I mean, like Ben Franklin, he wrote his autobiography with a view to the future, right? And so did Adams.
He did. John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Abigail, the whole Adams family does this. Thomas Jefferson, of course, did this. In fact, I believe Jefferson compiled this volume called The Annus. Historians have found like dinner napkins where he wrote something about some incident on there. And he left that for when he died. Nobody knew about this until after he had passed, that this existed. It was like Jefferson's take on all the events that he had witnessed. So I do think you find a lot of people in the founding generation, particularly families and men who knew that they were foundational and important to the founding of the United States, writing for history. So when you read their sources, when you read the papers of John Adams, or you read the papers of Thomas Jefferson, which you can do online, many of these documentary edited editions are available online or at your library in the physical books, you can read how they are thinking about the past and thinking about the events they participated in and always trying to set the record straight. And so I think that's what makes them really interesting.
Another thing that strikes me is how, if we look at the original colonies, how they represent some of the conflicts that we still see today.
I guess there are many different conflicts that we could see today. Again, different states vying for control and money and funding from the federal government and whatnot that they used to do back then. You can see it, I think, in some of the relations that the United States has with its northern neighbor in Canada, as well as its southern neighbor in Mexico, just because, Mexico was founded as a Spanish colony. So you have lingering politics that come from the 18th century between British North America and Spanish Mexico, even in the Caribbean islands where you had the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, a little bit. Portuguese were mainly in Brazil, which is in South America, of course, and the English having colonies in the Caribbean. And in Canada, of course, a lot of loyalists settled there during and after the American Revolution. So that especially in Eastern Canada, you'll see a lot of things that American culture is kind of there because it's a broader North American culture and British culture is there. I think you can see some of that today. You can, of course, see some of these politics and cultural things carry through in the racial politics that we have today. There was this idea, this actually is 2019, the 400th anniversary of Virginia 1619. And the reason that year is so big in Virginia history is that it was the establishment of the first limited legislative body in English North America. That happened in July 1619. And then in August 1619, just a few weeks later, you have the arrival of the first Africans. And so when you look at the history of Virginia in that period, it wasn't right away, but certainly by the 1630s, 1640s, you start to see the legalization of racialized slavery. And those ideas still hold forward into our present day. And you can see that, I think, as you look at early American, and then United States history as we go forward. So some of the conflicts we had back in early America still are present with us today. And maybe the past can help us find solutions. Maybe it can't. But I do think that there's a lot of continuity between the past and today.
Sometimes I can't decide whether to feel relieved or depressed about the fact that the same problems still exist.
Oh, yeah, I'm with you. I think about that sometimes. I'm like, oh, this day, could it get any worse? And then I'm like, the people in this historical period found this way and they found a way to muddle through. So it kind of also gives me hope that maybe they assume that things were just as bad as we are today or just as good, and they find a way through and forward. So it's one of those mixed feeling thoughts, as you said.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the tools that historians in particular of the period you're working, how they are maybe different if you're working on early American history than if you're studying another period?
Well, I think all historians really rely on two primary tools, and I'm thinking broadly. So one tool would be the historical record. So these are records, written records, oral records, material culture records, so the objects in our everyday lives. And that spans an entire spectrum. You have all sorts of different people writing or not writing, different newspaper accounts and reports, ways that cultures and peoples told oral histories. And then, of course, the objects, how things were made, why they were made, how they were used can tell us something about the past. So historians really do rely on the historical record as their primary tool. And then depending on what you're studying and who you're studying, you may need to apply different techniques to reading those records. The second primary tool we have is the historiography. And that's what historians call the history of writing about history. So think about all the history books ever written. That's the body of historiography. And so early America has its own version of historiography where it's all the books written about early America. And of course, you can go down, well, the American Revolution has its own historiography. But we do look at that. We look at all the books that were written about the periods and people we were studying, because that helps us see how different past historians interpreted the different history that we're studying. We can see the different techniques they use to read sources, whether we might be more critical, whether we have new sources that are available to us because the World Wide Web and the ability to share information quickly and widely has really improved our access to materials. So one historian in the 19th century might have written something about, say, the president's cabinet, for example, and a historian in the 21st century now has records that were available in foreign countries where they can see different ways that the cabinet was working. It might not be the best example, but I think you get the idea of we have more records available to us in American history. Of course, it's not isolated in the world. North America wasn't isolated, so records are kind of everywhere where different people interacted. So historiography is really great because it can help us see how those things were interpreted. And they do say that a great history book will tell you just as much about the past as the time it was written in. So we kind of get two histories through a history book. So those tools are really important for how we look at history and we think about it. We're always trying to be objective as historians, but no matter what we do, the present colors the way that we view the past. We can't help it. We'll never have an exact idea of what it was like to live in a past period. We can get close, I think, especially with each generation, but we'll never have an exact idea, just as people from the past can't really know what it is like for us to live in our own 21st century. So it works both ways.
Do you think it's an advantage to be studying a period where there is so much written material? I mean, I'm thinking about, 100 years from now, somebody's trying to study our period, it could actually turn out to be more challenging.
Yeah, I definitely think of that as like my historian's nightmare of just like all the digital records and social things we generate on social media and the different things we could look through. There's just so much information for historians to sift through. I also really like the written word and the feeling of the paper of the documents and seeing how their handwriting was. Like Philip Schuyler, he has horrible handwriting. Philip Schuyler of the Schuyler sisters' father, he was a general during the Revolutionary War. He came up a lot in my dissertation, and I was just always not happy when one of his secretaries didn't write it because, in the 18th century, official personnel usually had secretaries that would write in an official secretary's hand, and it's really clear and really easy to read. And then you read people like Philip Schuyler or Elkanah Watson or Abigail Adams, and they just don't have that great of handwriting. But think about that today. Like how many people might look at a doctor's record and be like, doctor script or lawyer script or something that was rushed in the moment that you just can't read clearly.
I'm going to break in here for just a minute to remind listeners that I need your help to reach new listeners. Of course, the first method is word of mouth, but reviews also help. If you post a review, be sure to send me a screenshot at docartemis@gmail.com so that I can send you an Amazon gift card. You can also support Books and Ideas via Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/booksandIdeas. I gave you the warning ahead of time that I was interested in this issue of applying Bayes' theorem to history. So before I ask you that question, I'm just going to introduce for my listeners what Bayes' theorem is, for those who don't know. It's a mathematical theorem written, I think, in the 17th century. And it basically is a way of calculating how probable something is based on what you thought about its probability and also the evidence. And that's a gross oversimplification. I've read a historian named Richard Collier argue that Bayes' theorem should be a basic historical tool for trying to figure out what happened in the past. I'm curious, or really not what happened, but the likelihood that a given event actually happened. I was just wondering about your take on that.
I hadn't ever heard of Bayes' theorem until you mentioned that we might be discussing it. So I looked it up, and so my understanding of it is that something could be more likely to happen statistically, and that the past gives us knowledge that suggests it might happen. And as I was thinking about it, it really came back to me, this idea of contingency. So good historians always try to relate the fact that past events are contingent, that nothing was preordained to happen. In fact, we have this saying that historians are great predictors of the past, but we know nothing of the future. We know very little of the future. And that's because in reality, when you look at an event, say, like the American Revolution, events like that happen because conditions, situation, and peoples all come together to interact in a certain way. And when you get down on a micro level, you can see that there is so much contingency. First off, no one knows really what the future holds with any exactness. And so they act in ways that are good for them at the time, or that they think will be beneficial or advantageous at the time. And, if one thing had gone a different way, say General John Burgoyne comes down the Hudson River to cut New England off from New York during the War for Independence. That was his plan. He came down from Canada, marched down the Hudson, and his goal was to meet with Henry Clinton at Albany. So Clinton was going to come up from New York, and another general was cutting west down Canada and into New York, all to converge at Albany. And the idea was to cut New England, the head of the snake of this rebellion, off from the rest of the colonies. Because the idea was, if you don't have noisy, disruptive New England, the other colonies will fall into line, and Great Britain can subdue the New English on their own after it's subdued the rest of the colonies. And this is what Burgoyne had hoped that would happen. Now, if the French hadn't sent supplies, or if those supplies had arrived later than they had, well, then all the battles that happened around the Saratoga battlefield could have happened very differently, because the Americans would have been ill-equipped. If Jane McCrae, who was this woman, she was a fiancée of a British officer, and she was scalped by British allied Native Americans just before the battle, and the Patriots use this, the revolutionaries use this. It's a great propaganda technique to encourage men to come out, because if you don't come out and fight with us, then the British will turn their Native American allies on Americans, and your women and children could be scalped. Again, that's propaganda, probably may not have happened, but if they hadn't had that incident, they wouldn't have had that propaganda. So the battle might have turned out differently, because Americans wouldn't have turned out for it. So there's all sorts of contingency involved. And you really see this when you do look at the records, because you can see that no one living during the 15th, 16th, or 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, all those centuries that comprise early America, understood that things like the United States would be. So everything has to happen the right way. And so as I thought about Bayes' theorem, that's what I was thinking about, is just this idea of contingency, and nothing from history is really preordained to have happened. Though, we tend to see it that way, right? Because we can only see the American Revolution happen, the United States becomes independent. So colonial America must be a precursor to the revolution. And we have to be careful as historians when we talk about history that way, because colonial America was not a precursor to the United States. No one in colonial America knew that the United States would happen and would be formed. So they all acted in different ways for different reasons. And that's what historians today are trying to suss out.
And from what little I've read, my impression is that most of them initially anyway saw themselves as British citizens. And a lot of the original things, even the Boston Tea Party, were about, hey, we're citizens and you're not treating us the way we should be treated.
No, and I would say that is definitely part of why the revolution happened. That famous idea that Paul Revere went out into the Middlesex County and started riding out and saying, the British are coming, the British are coming. Revere never said that. He would have said something like, the regulars are coming out, turn out, or the Lobster Backs, which was a derogatory term the Americans used to call the British soldiers occupying Boston. He would say the Lobster Backs are coming, but he never would have said the British because in his mind, he was British. And in 1775, in April 1775, when he made that ride, a lot of Americans thought reconciliation was bound to happen, that there was no real way they might fight and skirmish and go to war, but they were proud to be Britons and that they wanted reconciliation. It was really only by July 1776, a little before that really, that Americans decided no, that wasn't really a possibility and that maybe they should form an independent country. And of course, not all Americans agreed about that. So there's lots of different contingencies and ways to understand what happened that way.
So how did you get into podcasting?
You know, like a good historian, I read about them in a book and I thought, ooh, that's really great. And I started listening to podcasts. I was listening to podcasts about how to write my book, how to do social media and things I hadn't learned while in grad school. And I loved it. And then I said, ooh, I should look for a podcast about history. And my field is early America. So I wanted a podcast about early American history, but I couldn't find one of those. And I couldn't find a history podcast I really liked. The landscape of history podcasting has changed so much since 2011, 2012. And what I wanted was something that was in depth. I wanted, a podcast that didn't simplify history, that brought out its complexities, but did so in an accessible way. And so I decided after months of complaining that there wasn't a podcast about early American history, that I should just start one. So that's how Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history, came about.
So tell us a little bit about the evolution of Ben Franklin's World.
Ben Franklin's World is a podcast about early American history. It's interview driven. So each episode features conversations with historians who help us take like a deep dive into different topics about our early American past. I created the podcast in 2014. It launched in October 2014 because I love history and early American history in particular. And when I was in undergrad, I worked for the National Park Service in Boston. I worked for the Boston National Historical Park. And while I was there, it was really interesting because I'd heard from a lot of people that the public, the people in general, are just not interested in history. In order to get them into history, you have to simplify things. And interacting with visitors who would come to Boston and want to know more about the American Revolution was really eye-opening because I found people really are into early American history. They are into history, and that they don't want things sugar-coated. They want to connect with it, but they don't often know who to contact, what books to read, and how to think about history as a process, because history is a process. How people know what we know about the past. That's what I decided to do with Ben Franklin's World. It started with two questions. Were people really interested in well-researched, high-quality history? And if so, would they seek it out if they knew where to find it? And within 3 months, the podcast just took off. It filled this niche in the market. I've always worked to make it as well done as it possibly could be done, still do. And so the show has really evolved. So you'll hear things in my first episode where it's a hobby and, my mic wasn't the greatest thing for the first 15 episodes or so. So you can hear over time, like how my podcast becomes my job and my sole responsibility and how my audio quality improves. So there is an evolution of that. And today, because of the success of the podcast and help, I do produce the podcast as the digital projects editor of the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to producing some of the best scholarship out there that we know about on early American history. And that institution is based at William & Mary, the university. So together, we really do strive to help scholars produce great historical knowledge and to help those who really want to know more about our past access that knowledge and connect with it. So that's what I try to do in the podcast, is really connect people with their past so they do know who they are and how they came to be who they are.
What's the biggest surprise of all this to you?
How it helps people connect with the past. When you think about the way humans are wired, a lot of us are, through evolution, we are wired to be receptive to oral storytelling. And historians have lots of stories. And I think history in particular is really well suited to the podcast format. So Ben Franklin's World took off within 3 months. And what I mean by that is I went from 288 downloads to averaging 30,000 downloads in like 3 or 4 months. So there was a need, and the podcast has just grown leaps and bounds from them. But the way I get to interact with people too, through email or in-person events or through social media, I have real conversations with people, and we're able through the podcast to explore different ideas, and then through these other mediums, really able to dig deeper in areas that they want to dig deeper into. So I like to think that one of the big things that we're doing, and one of the surprises for me, is really the way we're able to talk about history and connect with it is so much more powerful through the podcast than just through reading a book.
And you never expected it was going to be your full-time job?
No, it was totally a hobby. I was working on finishing my book manuscript, turning my dissertation into a book manuscript. And the podcast was just an outlet because I fell in love with working with people and helping them connect with the past while I worked with the National Park Service and volunteered at museums like the New York State Museum and Albany Institute of History and Art. And I wanted to continue that work. So the podcast was an outlet to do that. And it just took off. As I tell my colleagues who are university professors, I have this unlimited classroom with so many thousands of students, and I get to connect with a lot of these people in real life. When you reach out, I really do read your email and send you a response, a well thought out response. So it takes me a little time to do that. But I think if people take the time to reach out to me, then I want to reach out back to them. So all of their questions help me think about the past as well. So I really enjoy that work.
And less grading of papers.
I don't have to grade anybody's papers. So everybody gets to come to class and there's no homework. And it's actually really much more fun than class because we try to keep it conversational. We do ask listener questions. So listeners submit questions in our Facebook group when they know we're interviewing someone, and we try to post every guest that we're going to have. They're able to ask questions. And if I can, I work them into the interview. And if not, I've been recording all answers to them as bonus episodes, which I hope to run shortly.
So what's the biggest lesson that you've learned?
There isn't one way to connect with history, and that we as historians need to be more open to using all the available media that we can to allow people to access the past in ways that they want to access it. And so if that means if you're into video, there should be high quality YouTube programs out there that would allow you to access the past. Podcasts, of course, I think there can't be too many podcasts on historical subjects. Books, articles, museum exhibits, websites. I think we can make, as a profession, more use of different media to really tell and provide people with more access to history. And I still am trying to prove this, but I have this idea that if people really understood history and the work historians do, then they'd help support it. We're working with that on the podcast, trying to get listeners to help support it because, as you know, Ginger, these podcasts are free to consume, but not free to produce. They take a lot of time, effort, and money to produce. If we can get into an environment where we're supporting each other doing this, then I think society would be a great place.
So what is something that you wish non-historians knew or understood about history?
I'd like them to know that history is a process, that it's the past that happened, but history is made, and that each generation makes history. So again, history tells us who we are and how we came to be who we are. So every generation goes to the historical record trying to figure out how they came to be. And so they look at the available historical records. Sometimes that's more or less than what they've had in the past, because I know from working on early New York, some of my records were burned. So the only way I can access them is through the work of earlier historians. And sometimes it's more records, of course. When we look at them, we interpret those records in a way that makes sense with the world around us. Because as I said, no matter how objective we try to be, our present way of living, our present world just shapes how we view the world and even the past. So we can't know exactly what it was like to live in the past, but I think we can get close because we do try to have that objectivity. And even in the end, this work, this historical process will tell us something about who we are and how we came to be who we are. And I think that's important. So history is a process. The past happened, history is made. And so when people talk about historical revisionism, yeah, every generation does it. We're always revising the past because the way we look at records, our ability to access records changes and increases, or in some cases, as I said, decreases over time. So revisionism is natural in history. And I think there, of course, there's that good revisionism where each generation does this process. and the bad revisionism where we simplify things and take things out of history that we don't like just so they better fit our worldview. A good historian will never do that, which is take things out of the historical past and create myths because they make us feel more comfortable about what happened.
Right. So what do you think the biggest challenge is going to be for future historians?
Well, one we talked about earlier, right, which is the sheer number of records being produced today. I think the Library of Congress was keeping like all tweets, and now they don't, or the National Archives rather. And now they have to kind of filter because there's just so much being generated. So I think the sheer number of records that we have is going to be a problem. And yes, a lot of them are digital, but you still have to make sure that people are applying the right metadata to those records to be able to search them properly and think about the ways that people are going to search them. So I think there's going to be a lot of challenges with the way historians work when they look at our present day, trying to figure out in the future what exactly happened. I also think a big challenge is the decline of what we call paleographic knowledge. So paleography is the ability to read historic handwriting. And I even have a hard time with this when you're talking about 16th and 17th century handwriting. It's like a foreign language because of the way they form their letters, speak English or Dutch, or because I do Dutch too. And words were different and had different meanings. So to really study some of those time periods, you really need to beef up on even your English language skills if English is your first language or whatever language that you're studying. But the fact that we don't teach kids in a lot of schools today calligraphy, because the idea is we have so many digital records, they don't need to know handwriting. Well, that's going to impact our ability to read and translate the historical record, even of the founding period, right? The 18th century. So I think that'll be a challenge as well.
I worry about digital records becoming lost if the medium they're on becomes obsolete.
Well, there's that case with NASA, right? Where they don't have an original recording of the moon landing because NASA just kept recording over it. People hadn't thought that this would be important. And I do believe I heard an NPR podcast about this. The only reason they were able to get what they have is because some woman from NASA saved the tape readers. Like NASA was getting rid of them because technology had improved, and she saved this old technology. And now they're at the National Archives or NASA Archives. They're at a government agency where they are using them to get whatever data is off these magnetic reels so that we have these records. So just because something is digitized doesn't make it permanent. Bytes decay. I know there's teams at the Library of Congress and in other major archives. There's librarians dealing with this and trying to figure it out. And it's complicated and there's not a lot of easy answers.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for students that might be interested in becoming historians?
I think one thing for every student of history, right, no matter whether you want to become a professional historian or not, is to start really using footnotes and endnotes. If you're interested about something that a historian said or a period that you were reading and you want to know more, footnotes and endnotes, they're great because you can just reference them and find more books and articles to read and podcasts to listen to. So I think that's an undervalued tool that students of history and practitioners of history can use. I also think about my own past, my own journey to becoming a historian. And there's so many things you can do with a history degree, whether it's an undergraduate degree or a graduate degree. And there's so many different history-related jobs that one could have that I think it's important to volunteer, find ways to work in all sorts of different history-related places. So museums, historic sites, libraries, archives, perhaps a university. You can get that kind of training if you go to graduate school. Just thinking about the wide possibilities of what you could do as a historian is good advice. And I don't think I took my own advice. That's the advice I give now. I was okay at taking it back then when I was a student studying for my history degrees.
Is there anything else you'd like to share?
History is a lot of fun, and there's a lot of things that we can learn from it. I do think that society is a better place when people think historically, which is, hey, we have problems that are surrounded by race. Why do we have these problems? And looking at the past to see how these problems arose, how people dealt with them. And perhaps we won't find answers to solve them, but we can also find answers about what won't work to solve them because, we're still struggling with them. So I think the past is inherently practical and useful in ways that people may not give it credit for. that's what I'm trying to do with my work, is to demonstrate the practicality of history and to help you understand how historians know what they know about the past, how history is created, how the past actually happened. And I love what I do. And if you get a chance, check out the podcast at benfranklinsworld.com or reach out if you have any questions. I'm on Twitter all the time at Liz Covart, or you can reach out at liz@benfranklinsworld.com.
Thanks so much, Liz. It's really been a joy talking with you.
Ginger, thank you so much for having me. And I really love the Books and Ideas podcast.
I want to thank Liz Covart for taking the time to talk with me. If you enjoy history, you should definitely check out Ben Franklin's World. My goal is to continue producing Books and Ideas on a monthly basis. Later this fall, I hope to do some episodes about physics and explore the question, why does everyone say that almost no one understands quantum mechanics? One reason I want to cover this topic is that people who promote pseudoscience often point to quantum mechanics to justify their ideas. I've been talking about this a little bit recently on brain science, but I want to delve into it more deeply. I'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas. Please send me your feedback to docartemis@gmail.com, or you can send me voice feedback via speakpipe.com/docartemis. You can also post, obviously, to the Books and Ideas Facebook fan page. Besides my time, the biggest expense associated with producing Books and Ideas is audio editing. If you would like to support Books and Ideas financially, please go to patreon.com/Books and Ideas. No matter what your financial situation is, you can help the show by sharing it with others. Just send them to booksandideas.com or tell them to subscribe in their favorite podcast app. It's always free. Books and Ideas will be back on October 15th. Until then, please check out my other shows, Brain Science and Grain Rainbows. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to talking with you again very soon. Books and Ideas is copyright 2019 to Virginia Campbell, MD. You can copy this show to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at docartemis@gmail.com. Theme music for Books and Ideas is The Open Door by Beatnik Turtle. Please visit their website at beatnikturtle.com.